Sehr schönen guten Tag, liebe Seherinnen und Hörerinnen des YouTube-Kanals der Zeitschrift International. Fritz Edlinger ist hier. Es ist dies ein kurzer Vorspann zu einem längeren Interview, das Sie dann gleich in Anschluss an mich hören werden. Das Gespräch hat geführt ein regelmäßiger Mitarbeiter unserer Zeitschrift, ein Schweizer Politikwissenschaftler, Pascal Lottaz, mit Jack Matlock Jr. Wer die letzten Wochen die Diskussionen um den Ukraine-Konflikt genauer verfolgt hat, der weiß inzwischen, worum es hier geht, wer Jack Matlock ist. Er war der letzte US-amerikanische Botschafter in der Sowjetunion. Er war also Zeitzeuge bei historischen Gesprächen, die heute wiederum angesichts des Konfliktes in der Ukraine eine wesentliche Rolle spielen. Ganz kurz nur ein Schlagwort: Osterweiterung der NATO. Es wird heute in den Diskussionen von russischer Seite ja immer wiederum darauf hingewiesen, dass es eine Nebenabsprache, dass es eine Garantie gegeben hat seitens der USA, dass sie die NATO nicht weiter in den Osten erweitern wird. Das wird heute eigentlich bis hin zum amerikanischen Präsidenten und Außenminister in Frage gestellt und abgestritten. Jack Matlock war dabei, wie diese Gespräche geführt worden sind. Er hat das auch in den letzten Jahren schon mehrfach publiziert. Er gehört also zu den fundierten Kritikern der US-amerikanischen Ostpolitik, der NATO-Politik, die uns im Moment ja an die Schwelle eines Krieges im Herzen von Europa gebracht hat oder bringt. In diesem Sinn hören Sie sich das lange Gespräch nachher an. Es ist in englischer Sprache, verständlicherweise. Es ist ein historisches Dokument und es freut mich, und ich möchte mich auch bei Pascal Lottaz nochmals bedanken, dass er dieses Gespräch ermöglicht hat und auch geführt hat. Das ist wirklich etwas, was historisch ist und was viele der aktuellen propagandistischen Lügen der USA und der NATO in Wirklichkeit enthüllt. In diesem Sinn kann ich auf gut Wienerisch nur sagen, schauen Sie sich das an. Und es würde mich freuen, wenn wir über dieses Gespräch auch in anderer Weise wiederum diskutieren könnten. Schreiben Sie uns, machen Sie Bemerkungen und verbreiten es weiter. Unser YouTube-Kanal ist immer für Messages gut, die jenseits des Mainstreams kritisch gegenüber dem Mainstream sind. In diesem Sinn, herzlichen Dank und bis zum nächsten Mal.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Pascal Lottaz. I'm here today with Ambassador Jack Matlock, one of the United States' most distinguished career diplomats, a man with an intricate knowledge of Soviet-Russian history to talk about the current crisis in Ukraine, but also about US and NATO relations with Russia more generally. It is a difficult task to introduce someone like Ambassador Matlock because the list of his achievements and extraordinary experiences is just so extensive. For instance, he witnessed the Cuban Missile Crisis as a diplomat in Moscow in 1962, and he became the director of Soviet affairs at the State Department in 1971, joining almost all major US-Soviet summit meetings in the 1970s. Ambassador Matlock served, among other postings, as US ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1981 to 1983, and most importantly, as the United States' last ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991, with his duties in Moscow ending only months before the dissolution of the country itself. After retiring from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Matlock turned to history, teaching, and writing. He wrote 3 books on the Soviet Union and on US foreign policy. The first one being an autopsy of an empire, published in 1995, in which he reflects on the end of the Soviet Union. Then Reagan and Gorbatschow, how the Cold War ended in 2004. And lastly, the book Superpower Illusions, how myths and false ideologies led America astray, and how to return to reality, which he published in 2010. Ambassador Matlock is a critic of some of the common narratives about the end of the Cold War and of NATO expansion, stating publicly that it was a mistake. Ambassador Matlock, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador Matlock, some people talk about the current situation as the beginning of a new Cold War. You, as somebody who has witnessed the real Cold War at the forefront of US foreign policy, do you share that opinion? Is this a fair assessment that we are now entering a new Cold War?
Well, we seem to be acting as if we are. I think there is no valid basis for it, however. The Cold War was really about the conflict between communism and, I would say, capitalism, between a totalitarian government based on Marxism-Leninism, which was a class struggle, of an ideology that validated revolutionary change, and which aimed for a socialist state governed by the proletariat, with the exclusion, even elimination of the other classes. Now, that was what was behind it. And in practice, once the Soviet Union began to try to spread its version of socialism, which was not what we call democratic socialism. It was better to call it communism. Once it started forcing that on other countries, usually by force, this brought about the Cold War with the United States bringing the with the United States organizing in Europe along with the West Europeans, NATO, in order to defend the West Europeans against what was then a communist, not only the Soviet Union, but they had under their control and in the Warsaw Pact allies in most of the East European states. So that the Cold War was really about the conflict between communism and democracy and capitalism. Now, it ended by negotiation when Gorbachev dropped the ideology that had undergirded the communist state, and not only dropped it as an ideology, but allowed the East European countries to choose a different course. So that, and this was actually in the interest of the Soviet Union, because the economy they had, the state-run economy that tried to supplant a market economy with everything controlled by the state, prices, everything else, and with no private property in the means of production. This turned out to be a very inefficient system in terms of meeting the real needs of people. So that, first of all, he cooperated with the West to end the arms race, which was certainly in their interest because it was costing them and their economy a lot more than it was costing us in the West. We also recognized that the arms race had brought about an absolutely dangerous arms race in nuclear weapons and even in other weapons of mass destruction, because the Soviet Union, excuse me, was developing biological weapons. They had large stocks of chemical weapons. And, you know, although I think neither side was going to attack the other, the reasons for these was to keep the other from attacking. Nevertheless, there was a real danger of mistake, miscalculation, and one that became very close in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and stumbling in to a nuclear war. Well, we were able, in the period of 3 or 4 years in the late 1980s, to turn this around, to begin to concentrate on things we both needed to do, things that we could cooperate on. And it was in the interest of both countries to reduce that arms race. In fact, all the others, because if there had been a nuclear accident and this had spread, it's going to affect everybody. In fact, at its height, there were enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization 7 times over, as it was calculated. Other people said, well, you know, maybe 12. And I wondered why one even wants to risk one. So I think that one of the mistakes we make was to think that there was a victory of the West or the United States or of NATO in ending the Cold War. It was a negotiated solution in everybody's interest. And it was possible because Gorbachev changed radically the rationale for the Cold War, the ideological rationale, by ending the competition between capitalism and socialism. Now, today, Russia and China are basically capitalist countries. Okay, China has a communist party which which actually maybe controls a lot, but essentially both Russia and China are, you would say, partners, competitors if you wish, but that's what, after all, capitalism is all about in a way, competition to see who can produce the most goods most effectively and so on. So there is actually no basis for what we now call a renewed Cold War on an ideological scale. The second thing I think that came out of it was a widespread perception of both in the West and in Russia that the breakup of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War. This is incorrect. The Cold War ended at least 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up. And the breakup of the Soviet Union was not something that the United States and most of its allies sought. As a matter of fact, the first President Bush, in a famous, at that time, speech to the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, advised the Ukrainians and the other non-Russian republics, with the exception of the 3 Baltic countries, to adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty, because Gorbachev was trying to negotiate a voluntary federation. And though the 3 Baltic states, we never considered legally part of the Soviet Union and considered they had a right and should regain their independence, we would have been very happy to live with a voluntary federation of 12 republics. But Gorbachev, in pressing democratization, and that was sincere, in effect removed the Communist Party from total control of the country. And then various problems. Again, the economy tended to collapse with the change. and at the same time, the nationalism of the various non-Russian peoples and republics began to develop. And the fact is that when the Soviet Union broke up, that breakup was led by the elected leader of the Russian Federation. It was not pressure from the West. And I tell Russians, don't blame us. You elected the man that brought down the Soviet Union by cooperating first with the Ukrainian and Belarusian leaders, and that without the cooperation of Russia, that probably would not have happened. But the next thing is that this was interpreted by many in the West, and particularly in the United States, as leaving us, the world, with only one superpower. The legend went that, well, we had two superpowers before, they ran the world. Now we have only one, so it can run the world. Both of those statements are incorrect. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union didn't run the world. If we had, we would have solved the problems in the Middle East and many other places. And if you mean that superpower is equivalent to, you might say, a large arsenal of nuclear weapons, I would have to ask, well, power for what? Yes, power to destroy. We each could have destroyed the world. But is it power that allows you to change other people's lives? Is it power that allows you, an outsider, to create democracy in another country? After all, democracy was famously defined by our President Lincoln as of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, how can an outsider create that? As a matter of fact, when outsiders start interfering in domestic politics, even with the best of intention, it tends to backfire. So I think the problem was that instead, in the 1990s, of reinforcing European security by an inclusive organization, which would certainly include Russia and the other European members of the Soviet Union. Instead of working toward that, the decision was made in the late 1990s to begin expanding NATO. That was something that I and others strongly advised against. Now, we can continue now. I would say that the current crisis is one in which President Putin has indicated that his major problem has been the continued expansion of NATO, and he wants assurances it will stop now. But you know, the problem is more than just the expansion of NATO. Because we not only began expanding NATO, and at first that was accepted by the President Putin. He didn't particularly like it, but he accepted it. He even accepted inclusion of the 3 Baltic states. As I have pointed out, that was always an exception in our policy. We always felt that they should have their independence. But when the expansion continued, and not only that, the Bush administration began to withdraw from the arms control treaties that had been the basis of ending the Cold War. First, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, then others. And I think that combination, plus then the efforts of Americans and the West Europeans to bring about revolutions in some of the former Soviet states, the color revolutions, Orange Revolution, Rose Revolution, etc. These were considered interference in countries that, though they were now independent, they had been part of Russia sometimes for centuries. And obviously, all countries are very sensitive to what happens on their borders, none more so than the United States, which has always reacted if there were attempts by European powers to establish some base in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly in the Caribbean or Central America. So it's hard for me to understand why our political leaders do not understand that whatever we may think of policies that President Putin has been following in Russia, and if I were a Russian, I would be very much worried about some of them, but that's Russia's problem. And the idea that somehow we can influence things for the better by supporting, I would say, military actions, particularly in areas that are very close to them, or bringing an alliance right up to his borders, I think is deeply mistaken. And I know you may want to just add one more thing, and that is that also the use of economic sanctions, I believe, is not producing results that are intended. And yet the difficulties tend to weigh most heavily on ordinary people, and yet not so much on those who are making the political decisions. So that I think this almost fetish of economic sanctions is not achieving its ends, and in many cases is simply making the situation worse. So to get back to your original question, yes, we are acting as if we're in a Cold War. I think that is hugely mistaken.
I view the situation as you do. I mean, I'm quite glad to hear this from you, because you've got such an you've seen the real Cold War. The ideological base is gone, and all that's left is the geopolitical confrontation that's now being framed in these same terms. But the underground is completely different. So Steve Wold recently in a foreign policy article called this a failure of empathy, a failure of understanding what the world looks like from the other position, especially from Russia.
Yes.
Why? Why does the West do this? It seems almost as if though the West is caught in a form of ideology that it has real problems getting out of, at least certain decision makers that even when you tell them that NATO is a threat to Russia will shake their heads and say, how can anyone perceive NATO as a threat?
Yes, well, I think he's right. And you know, this to some degree is true of every country. So much of the foreign policy is driven by domestic politics. Mm-hmm. And I think we see that both of our parties, by the way, the leaders of both of our parties seem to be on this kick of trying to act as if we are in a new Cold War with both Russia and China. And I think they are responding often to emotional issues, often sometimes to, domestic pressures. our military-industrial complex has very, very deep roots in Congress. Military industries are in almost every congressional district. And quite frankly, when we expanded NATO, some of the most effective lobbyists were our military industrial companies like Lockheed and others who wanted to sell the arms to the countries in Eastern Europe. And I think that this means that, though I don't think many think about this casually, directly, but you don't need supersonic aircraft and flotillas of aircraft carriers to deal with terrorism. That has been the real threat, since 9/11. But you need a big enemy, a big country. Russia, China meet that requirement. A small one like Iran is not quite enough. So I think that, politically there are, and second, I think that for some reason in American politics, and I think this is true of many other countries, I'm not saying we're exceptional here, that the pressures, particularly the idea for prestige and so on, are so great domestically. Now, take the United States, when President Biden finally withdrew from Afghanistan, something that should have happened at least 10 years ago. Well, everybody wanted that to happen, but because of the way it was carried out, he probably dropped nearly 10 points, in his approval. So, and I would say, people don't like to feel that their president is a loser. And that's true of just about every country, including Russia. Yes, I think this is a problem. One of the things that I had going for me when I was working for President Reagan was that he did have empathy. And maybe it was because he was trained as an actor. It was often said, oh, he's only an actor. What does he know about politics? But he was able to put himself in the shoes of the other person. He spent more time thinking about and learning about Gorbachev, where he was coming from, what motivated him, and so on, than he did on a lot of other things. And though he was not, he didn't know a lot of the facts about history and so on, he was not an intellectual in that sense.
But you trained him.
You understand human beings.
You did a mock-up meeting, right? Between Gorbachev and Reagan, and you were playing Gorbachev. Yes. Actually,
before two of the meetings, we would have a little rehearsal, and I knew what Gorbachev's arguments were going to be on some things because he had said them on television, and we knew that. So yes. We did do that in the warm-up at two of the summit meetings.
That is a very convenient way to bring me to another question. The Russia today, with what is currently going on in Ukraine, is saying vehemently over and over again that it is not planning to invade Ukraine. It will not go to war. It's not planning to do that. Or at the same time, from all the Western media, we hear the Russian troops, invasion is imminent, invasion is imminent, to the point that even the Ukrainian president said we should not we should not hype this up. What do you make out of this situation where the West seems to be worried of something that the other side is so vehemently denying? How do you make sense of this?
Well, I don't think it makes sense. I think we have a group, particularly in Washington and maybe also in London in particular, that are totally devoted to almost circular reasoning on these issues. It's very hard to get a contrary view in our major publications. And there has been, it would seem, almost a campaign to demonize President Putin and to deal with these issues personally. Now, that is never, I think, a good thing. Ronald Reagan very much condemned communism. He talked of an evil empire. He never once publicly insulted a Soviet leader personally. And, you know, I don't understand, quite frankly, how educated people can somehow follow a course which seems to be to have little logic at all. I'm often reminded of that wonderful line in poetry, oh, what some power the gifty gives to see ourselves as it'll see us. Burns, the Scottish poet. It's difficult, I guess, for most people. But the fact is that I do think that we are doing ourselves and others a disservice, as is President Putin, who is also dealing in a very emotional way and handling this as if he is demanding sort of a public capitulation on these issues by President Biden. That's not going to work. So it's not that this current thing is all on just one side. But the tragedy is that Ukraine's problems are internal. And the support for just one side, and particularly military support, is not going to solve this. And without, I would say, without the Western interference, that would be much easier to come to a peaceful solution. Now, at least that's my opinion. And honestly, I mean, I've been very critical of the way we have handled it, but I don't excuse the way President Putin has handled it. As I said, his own rhetoric has been sort of, you know, do what I say or else. Now, I do think that despite the public appearances, each side, even with these harsh words, end by saying, we're going to continue our negotiations. And we want to achieve strategic stability. I think, I don't believe President Putin intends to invade Ukraine. It would be a catastrophe for Ukraine, certainly, but also for Russia in many respects. And he's a smart man. I don't think he's going to do that. But I think that the way, and I think that it would have been better if our response had been a little more moderated. I don't know why, you might say, our media has been, you know, so involved in hyping the prospect of war. I mean, I cannot imagine that actually there is going to be an invasion. And so far as supporting the Russian speakers in in the East, in the Donbass, my goodness, we support people in a lot of different countries. We've got troops in Syria that were not requested by the Syrian government. So, I mean, it does seem to me that we don't really have a good reason for this rhetoric. On the other side, I think Putin must know very well that there is virtually no chance that Ukraine is going to get into NATO in the foreseeable future, among other things. It would take a unanimous vote of all the NATO members. And it's already clear that some countries like Hungary and maybe Croatia and others would not vote. I doubt that either France or Germany would. So in a sense, I think he is exaggerating the threat to his. But I do think, and I think that both sides, if they will quietly begin to find more things that we can cooperate on and can lower the rhetoric, that might produce an outcome. So I'm not totally discouraged here. I think that, frankly, I think our media has not been very responsible in its coverage. And by, in effect, placing President Biden under a great public pressure not to back down, that they are certainly not finding a way to solve it. But with all the negotiation going on, I mean, there have been more than one meeting a week of senior officials. I think diplomacy is going on, and I hope it will begin to show some results so that I don't think we're on the brink of war. But the problem is, I think we're in effect making it more difficult to solve the problems unless the message to the Ukrainians is it really so bad to create, a federal system and give a certain autonomy to the Donbass? They're committed to do this since the agreement in Minsk, and they steadfastly refuse. There are reports that President Biden is pressing them to do that. Well, I don't know. I hope he is. But so there may be things going on that the press is giving a little attention to, and I hope that these will produce some positive effects. Certainly, there is no reason in the world to think that this is a contest between democracy and autocracy and things like that. Ukraine, unfortunately, is very close to a failed state, and it's certainly not all Russia's fault. But I think I would hope that despite all the rhetoric, our people who are making decisions understand that.
May I ask you about, as a diplomat, a career diplomat, this tactic of Russia was highly interesting on December 17 to publish 2 draft treaties, one to the US and one to NATO, and say, like, this is the basis of negotiation we want. I found this highly unusual, and it kind of, it plays into this public diplomatic sphere. How do you interpret this approach? Because it obviously is not just, it's not a position of strength that it creates for Russia, because it creates this baseline from which they now cannot back down. What do you think that the negotiation strategy with this is?
Well, I don't know. You'll have to ask them. We found during the Cold War that publicizing proposals as if there were challenges didn't work. And one of the first things when I was advising we began to do was to test out our proposals quietly. Well, we'd like to propose this. Is this okay? Is there something wrong with it? Let's try to find a way. And increasingly, we were able to find ways to get around the big problems. And when you publicly push something, I would say that in the 90s, I believe we did not have a Russian government that was really capable of making a proposal quietly as to how they could be integrated in European security. There were several possible routes, for example, by strengthening the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There could be other things. And there could have been organizations that included a NATO with its original members, for example, and operating with what was then proposed as the Partnership for Peace with all the other countries. I think it was the failure of our Western governments in the 1990s that we didn't come up with that. Instead, we used NATO expansion, which was going to eventually create just the sort of problem we have today. Now, President Medvedev, during his term of office, also proposed a treaty. I think it was a big mistake not to take that seriously. And it may be a mistake today not to take seriously, but I don't know to what degree our governments are taking it seriously as part of the negotiations that are going on. Certainly the public image of sort of a challenge is not helpful, but some of that may be created by the media rather than the governments.
I find it highly regretful that we keep forgetting that some of the most important European peace initiatives during the détente came from Russia. The initiative for the CSCE was a Soviet initiative that was channeled through the neutral countries, and in the end, after 5 years of negotiation, led to a wonderful breakthrough. So I do not completely comprehend why the West today is rejecting these Russian calls for literally what they call again and again a common European security architecture. Why this is being completely discarded as a Russian propaganda, I fail to comprehend that, because it seems to me that this is sincere. Would you also think that Russia is honest about this, or do you think there's other motives that they might have?
Well, I think they have a right to have a certain, secure borders. And I think Gorbachev was right when he talked about, security is indivisible. You either have it for everybody or you have it for nobody. And that, I think, is basically true. If there was a mistake, it was the way it was done. Now, quite honestly, I have not looked at the details, and I've not been involved in policymaking now for 30 years in the United States. So I'm very much an outsider in that respect. But I have been all along, from the time we were negotiating the end of the Cold War, a believer in creating a European security structure that included everybody. Because you're not going to have security if you start excluding particularly large countries such as Russia. And the idea that cultures in Russia and Western Europe are diametrically opposed is nonsense. Of course, the Russians are Europeans. They're not exactly like the others, but the Swedes are not exactly like the Italians, for crying out loud, or the Finns like the Spaniards. This idea that Russia is not Europe, Russia has been a major part of international relations in Europe, since certainly the 18th century and even earlier to some degree. So, you know, this idea that somehow we've got to defend Western civilization, which for a couple of centuries has meant Western, European and North American domination of the world with colonialism and so on. Now that's no longer there, but I think the future really is going to have to involve cooperation and in a security sense, stop trying to these geopolitical games, which brought us 2 world wars in the 20th century. In a nuclear age, in an age where it is so easy to develop biological weapons, in an age when cyber warfare can bring everything to its end, we don't need these confrontations. We need to act to calm things. And if some borders need to be changed and the people there want to change them, there should be a way to do it. So, you know, I think that so often the emotions, that the idea that if we, you know, if we back down, we are not defending democracy. I mean, this just has no basis in fact.
I cannot lose the impression that this time it is us who are under some delusions. And what you're saying, for example, Bosnia, I mean, if it was self-determination that would make borders, Bosnia would look entirely different today, but this is something that NATO and the European Union would not accept. So are we deceiving ourselves right now into believing into certain ideals?
I'm sorry, what?
Are we deceiving ourselves into believing in certain ideals that then are not carried out at all in certain respects? I mean, like the Bosnia, but also the way we treat, for example, the Golan Heights, while Golan Heights and Crimea have striking similarities, but these are being completely disregarded, at least in the media.
Yeah, well, yes, the attitude toward these things is quite, I think, quite confused in some respects. The problem, well, there is a matter of self-determination, but there should also be a recognition of the rights of minorities. And if that's the definition of a more advanced democracy. So the fact that one language group or religion or whatever is 60% of the population, does that mean they can exclude the other 40%? And I think this is one of the problems that, particularly in the Balkans and particularly in Bosnia, you had in the cities a total mixture. There was no way, without moving most of the people, that you could get consolidated areas, you know, with just one nationality. And then what do you do about all the intermarriage, which is very common in the cities? So I think you have to balance that. But on the other hand, if you're speaking of Crimea, which under the Soviet Union had a certain autonomy within Ukraine, and Sevastopol, where the naval base was not subordinated to Ukraine, but to Moscow. And this was something, a transfer that occurred sort of by the decision of one man, Nikita Khrushchev. Now, one can say that the referendum was carried out under pressure. It was, but then I'm sure that 96% or whatever the percent was of them didn't really want to go to Russia. But I'm also pretty sure that if you took a poll today, at least 70% or so of the residents would say, I'd rather be in Russia. Actually, what they would really want is total autonomy to the point of independence. But when you compare this to the way we treated Kosovo, we in effect, went to war. People were killed, much property was destroyed, and we were actually the first to violate a commitment under the Helsinki Final Act, which was that when borders are changed, both parties must approve. Serbia has not approved. And those in the northern part of Kosovo, which is largely Serb, are not allowed now to join Serbia. And of course, this is one of the things that Putin points out, that you have changed borders unilaterally after killing people, in effect making war. How many casualties were they in the takeover of Crimea? 0. So, there are many, I know that, lawyers are sort of trained to argue either side of an issue. And my point is not that everything Putin does is right, far from it. But the things we're accusing him of, the United States and its Western allies can also be accused. And if it is a matter of unprovoked aggression, didn't the United States, against the advice of Russia, Germany, and France, invade a country that had not attacked it, was nowhere near, that is Iraq? And now, so for us to say, oh, we've got to stand up to Russia because it's belligerent, it's trying to change borders. So now, wait a minute. These are problems. But to assume that we can be the lawgiver, the judge, the jury, the enforcer, no, that's not going to work, and it isn't working. And I would hope that that I would say, sound heads would begin to work these things out. Our media is not helping, and undoubtedly some of them were encouraged by elements in the government for what they're doing. But I do think that I'm sure a huge majority of the American people do not want us to get involved in another war. And if we did, that would be the end of Biden. I mean, politically. So I think they know that. So what we're seeing to some degree is a charade. And I think that, and I hope both sides are going to gradually calm down. I don't think Russia will invade. And we have always made clear that, well, if we send more to Europe, we're not going to put them in Ukraine.
I have one large hope, which is people like you. From my own studies, I am keenly aware how good the State Department is at hiring realists who actually really look at things, how things work on the ground. You stand in a long tradition. Joseph Grew, who was ambassador to Japan the 10 years right before the war, had a deep love and admiration for Japan and understood the internal politics extremely well. George Kennan, the long telegram. This man understood Russia, the Soviet Union, I would believe, extremely well. Jack Matlock, you understand the dynamics on the ground like no other. maybe the last question. I know that you haven't been involved in diplomacy, but you've educated some of the current US diplomats. Is the State Department still that State Department, that the career diplomats who are rational thinking, the people who actually negotiated, or did the State Department change as well?
Well, I think it's very, since I'm not in the State Department now, it's very hard for me to judge. I think that unfortunately, when the Cold War was over, Russian studies in the United States tended to decrease. We had really fewer people studying seriously, even though now the country was open and there were opportunities there. From the time I started learning Russian, it took me 13 years before I was ever even able to visit, because at that time, but we had sort of major centers for study of Russia. And although we have some fine people, students still, I think that the State Department has, it's not so much the State Department, but because actually so many of our senior diplomats and the senior people in the State Department are political appointees. And after all, one of the ambassadors that we sent to Moscow at a time when things began to go seriously bad, was not a professional diplomat. He was a political scientist. You know, dealing with people. And I think that diplomacy is eminently dealing with people. It's not theory. And if you get too hung up in some theory and you forget the personal aspect, you know, some realist theoreticians, at the crudest, they say they think of interaction between countries like billiard balls. That's considered realist. And yet, that is a false analogy. Countries are not solid objects like billiard balls. They're all have divisions of various kinds, different types of leadership. But whoever the leader is, he or she is a human being with all of the faults that most of us have. A certain amount of egotism. How do you get to the top without egotism? And so on. A political need to be seen in control of things, and particularly not to be humiliated publicly. So, you know, I think these human factors play a very great role. I know, and that's something that we do seem to have forgotten. And in general, I would say that the State Department has been to some degree gutted of a lot of the people. There were widespread resignations when Trump was elected, and so on. And then we got into this ridiculous competition of throwing out diplomats. So now we have fewer posts in Russia, they have fewer posts in the United States, and the number of personnel has been reduced to the point that we, you know, whether they're good or not, there are not enough people really to do the work that needs to be done. So this is quite tragic, and I hope that it's going to change. And but I know we still have fine people, but I do know that over the years, we have lost a lot of good ones too. I can't really say much more.
Thank you for that assessment, Ambassador Matlock. And we've been talking now for an hour. I would have more questions to you, but I do think we have to wrap it up at some point. I hope maybe to talk to you again. I mean, your analysis and your insights, and especially the fact that you can draw from so many experiences, makes your analysis very, very special. So thank you very much for talking to me today, and I'm sure we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a very good day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.